March 4, 1944. 20,000 feet above the frozen German countryside, hundreds of American bombers droned toward their target, Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. For 2 years, these flying fortresses have been bleeding in the skies over Europe, shot down in their hundreds by German fighters while their escorts, limited by fuel, had to turn back at the border. But today is different. Today something is about to happen that will change the course of the war. Something that will send a shockwave through the Luftwaffe command and cause Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring to utter words that would become legend. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. This is the story of that moment, the exact moment when Germany's greatest pilots looked up at the sky above their own capital and realized they had lost the war. To understand why March 4th, 1944 mattered so much, we need to go back. Back to the dark days of 1943, when the Allied bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. The Americans believed in precision daylight bombing. The theory was simple. Fly in tight formations at high altitude, use the Norden bomb site to hit specific industrial targets, and rely on the heavy defensive armament of the bombers to protect themselves. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a bloodbath. The numbers tell the story. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg. Of the 376 bombers that set out, 60 were shot down, 600 men killed or captured in a single day. Another 47 planes were so badly damaged they never flew again. The problem was painfully simple. American fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only fly so far before their fuel ran out. They'd escort the bombers to the German border, then turn back. And that's when the Luftwaffe would pounce. The German pilots had a term for it: target-rich environment. American bomber crews had a different name. They called it Held at October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. A second raid on Schweinfurt. Of 291 bombers that crossed into Germany, 77 were shot down, another 121 were damaged. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was dying. Bomber Command suspended deep penetration raids into Germany indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had won, or so they thought. North American aviation had designed the P-51 Mustang in 1940 in just 117 days. It was fast, nimble, and beautiful, with its sleek lines and graceful profile. But early models had a fatal flaw. Their Allison engines lost power at high altitude. The British tried using them as low-level reconnaissance aircraft. They were good, but not great. Then someone had an idea. What if they took the American airframe and put a British engine in it? The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, was a supercharged masterpiece that performed brilliantly at altitude. The marriage of American aerodynamics and British engineering created something extraordinary. The P-51B, with its Merlin engine, was 50 miles per hour faster than anything the Germans had at 28,000 feet. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and most importantly, it had range, incredible range. With drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, a Mustang could fly over 100 miles. That meant it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time in the war, American bombers would have fighter protection over the German capital. But having the plane and getting it into action were two different things. The P-51 production was ramping up, but slowly. Fighter groups had to be retrained. Tactics had to be developed. And there was resistance from some quarters who wanted to stick with the proven P-47 Thunderbolt. By early 1944, the pieces were finally falling into place. The 4th Fighter Group, one of the most experienced units in the 8th Air Force, received their first P-51Bs on February 28, 1944. Their commanding officer, Colonel Donald Blakesley, was a veteran with 9 confirmed kills. He was also impatient. When told it would take weeks to transition his pilots to the new aircraft, Blakesley reportedly said, "My pilots can learn to fly them on the way to the target." The next day, February 29th, the 4th Fighter Group flew its first operational mission in Mustangs. 4 days later, they would make history. The morning of March 4, 1944 dawned cold and overcast across eastern England. At air bases throughout East Anglia, ground crews prepared over 700 heavy bombers for the day's mission. The target was Berlin, specifically the VKF ball bearing plant, the Bosch electrical works, and other industrial targets in the German capital. It would be the first major American daylight raid on Berlin. The British had been bombing the city at night, but daylight precision bombing of Hitler's capital would be a powerful psychological blow as well as a strategic strike. The bomber crews knew this was going to be different. Word had spread that they'd have fighter escort all the way to the target. Some were skeptical. They'd heard promises before, but the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, along with other Mustang-equipped units, knew they were about to prove something. At 10:30 a.m., the first bombers lifted off. By noon, a massive aerial armada was forming up over England, 658 heavy bombers escorted by 800 fighters, including the precious Mustangs that would go all the way. For the German defenders, the morning started normally enough. Radar stations along the coast picked up the incoming formation. Luftwaffe fighter groups scrambled across northern Germany. This was the routine they'd perfected over 2 years of combat. The Americans would come in, the escorts would turn back, and then the real battle would begin. But today, something was wrong. As the bombers crossed into Germany, the American fighters didn't turn back. They kept coming. Worse, there were new fighters among them. Sleek, fast aircraft that the German pilots didn't immediately recognize. Major Heinz Baer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, was among the first to engage. His unit intercepted the bomber stream near the German border, expecting the usual pattern. But as they closed in, these new American fighters tore into them with shocking aggression and speed. They were everywhere, Baer would later recall, faster than our 109s, more maneuverable than we expected, and they had the range to stay with the bombers. For the first time, we were the ones being hunted. The sky over central Germany became a three-dimensional battlefield. German fighters tried their standard tactics, head-on attacks on the bomber formations, diving from above, attacking stragglers. But everywhere they turned, there were Mustangs. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group was in his element. An aggressive pilot who would finish the war with over 20 aerial victories. Gentile stalked a Messerschmitt Bf-109 through the clouds, staying on its tail through desperate evasive maneuvers until his guns found their mark. The German fighter exploded in mid-air. His wingman, Captain John Godfrey, shot down 2 more. All around them, the new Mustangs were proving their worth. The P-51 wasn't just as good as the German fighters. In many ways, it was better. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 were formidable aircraft, flown by experienced pilots. But the Mustang had advantages that were becoming brutally apparent. Its laminar flow wing design gave it less drag and better performance at high speeds. The Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger meant it didn't lose power at altitude like earlier American fighters. And then there was the psychological factor. German pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of battle. They knew when the escorts would have to turn back. They knew they'd have time to regroup, refuel, and attack again. Now suddenly, that safety margin was gone. As the bomber stream approached Berlin, Luftwaffe commanders were receiving frantic reports. American fighters over Brunswick, over Magdeburg, and they weren't turning back. They were still coming. At Luftwaffe headquarters, the reality was sinking in. These weren't just any fighters making a one-way suicide run. These were long-range escorts that could go the distance and return home. The entire strategic equation had just changed. The bombers reached Berlin in the early afternoon. The city's formidable flak defenses opened up, thousands of anti-aircraft guns throwing up a curtain of exploding steel. The sky turned black with bursting shells. Bombers shuddered as shrapnel tore through their thin aluminum skin. But the Mustangs were there, weaving through the flak, protecting their charges, and engaging any German fighter that dared approach. It was unprecedented. Never before had Berlin's defenders faced such a coordinated and protected assault in daylight. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, another experienced Luftwaffe pilot, was scrambling from an airfield south of Berlin. As he climbed toward the bomber stream, he could see American fighters circling above the city itself. Above the Reichstag, above the Brandenburg Gate, above Hitler's own bunker. It was the worst feeling I ever had in combat, Knoke would write in his diary, to see enemy fighters over our capital, knowing they had flown all the way from England and would fly all the way back. In that moment, I knew we could not win this war. He wasn't alone in that realization. All across the Luftwaffe, from frontline pilots to staff officers, the appearance of long-range American fighters over Berlin sent a clear message. German airspace was no longer inviolable. The Reich could be struck anywhere, anytime, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The bombing itself was less successful than hoped. Heavy cloud cover obscured many targets, and bombs fell across a wide area of the city. Only about a third of the bombers hit their primary targets, but that almost didn't matter. The psychological and strategic impact of the raid wasn't measured in destroyed factories. It was measured in the shattered myth of German air superiority. For the bomber crews, the return flight was a revelation. Usually, the trip home was when they were most vulnerable, short on ammunition, damaged from flak and fighters struggling to maintain formation. But today, the Mustangs stayed with them. When German fighters tried to pick off stragglers, the P-51s were there to intercept. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 15 enemy aircraft destroyed. Other Mustang units added to the tally. And crucially, bomber losses were significantly lower than previous deep penetration raids. Of the 658 bombers that set out, 37 were lost, a 5.6% loss rate. Terrible by any normal standard, but compared to the 25–30% losses of the Schweinfurt raids, it was almost miraculous. As the bombers and their escorts crossed back over the English Channel, the pilots knew they'd witnessed something historic. Radio chatter was alive with excitement. The ground crews at the bases in England could tell from the way the pilots were talking that something extraordinary had happened. When Colonel Blakesley landed and climbed out of his Mustang, he was mobbed by intelligence officers wanting to know every detail. His assessment was characteristically blunt. The aircraft is superb. We can take the bombers anywhere now. The impact on German morale was immediate and profound. Hermann Goering, once the swaggering leader of an air force that had terrorized Europe, was beside himself. As Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, the appearance of American fighters over Berlin was a personal humiliation. Goering had famously boasted in 1940 that if Allied aircraft ever bombed Berlin, people could call him Meyer, a common Jewish surname meant as the ultimate insult to himself. The British had made a liar of him in 1940, and now the Americans were rubbing salt in the wound in broad daylight. His oft-quoted statement, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," may be apocryphal or may have been said later in reflection. But whether he said it exactly that way or not, the sentiment was accurate. Goering understood better than most what this meant for Germany's war prospects. Hitler's response was predictably delusional. Rather than acknowledging the strategic disaster, he demanded more fighter production, blamed the Luftwaffe commanders for cowardice, and insisted on miracle weapons that would turn the tide. But his generals and Air Force officers knew better. German fighter pilot Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive the war to become a post-war Luftwaffe general, put it simply, the appearance of American fighters over Berlin was the beginning of the end for us. We could still win individual battles, shoot down many bombers, even maintain local air superiority for short periods, but the strategic war was lost that day. The March 4th raid was just the beginning. Over the following days and weeks, American bombers returned to Berlin again and again, always with Mustang escorts. The Luftwaffe fought back desperately, but they were fighting a losing battle. On March 6th, another massive raid on Berlin. On March 8th, yet another. The Americans were demonstrating that they could strike the German capital at will. The mighty Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe from 1939 to 1942, was being systematically destroyed. The numbers tell the story of German decline. In the first 3 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,000 experienced fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded. These weren't rookies. These were veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, men who could never be replaced. German aircraft production actually increased during 1944, testament to the efficiency of Albert, Speer's armaments ministry, and the resilience of dispersed production facilities. But they couldn't produce experienced pilots fast enough to replace the losses. Young German pilots were being thrown into combat with minimal training, flying against American and British pilots who had the benefit of extensive instruction, superior aircraft, and, increasingly, numerical superiority. The Mustang became the symbol of American air power. By the spring of 1944, P-51 groups were claiming hundreds of aerial victories, but even more importantly, they were allowing the heavy bombers to strike deep into Germany with increasing impunity. The Americans refined their tactics. Instead of just escorting bombers defensively, Mustang pilots were encouraged to be aggressive, to pursue German fighters, to strafe airfields, to hunt down the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it. Fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations would clear the sky of defenders before the heavies arrived. One of the most devastating tactics was the strafing of German airfields. Mustangs, with their long range, could penetrate deep into Germany, locate Luftwaffe bases, and attack aircraft on the ground. German fighters were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing, precisely when they were scrambling to intercept incoming bombers. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, who would finish the war as one of the top American aces in Europe with 24 victories, described the new approach. We stopped thinking of ourselves as just bomber escorts. We were offensive fighters. Our job was to destroy the Luftwaffe, in the air, on the ground, wherever we could find them. For German pilots, the psychological pressure was enormous. They were being asked to intercept massive bomber formations protected by swarms of superior fighters, then return to bases that might be under attack by marauding Mustangs. Fuel was becoming scarce, spare parts were increasingly unavailable, and death was the most likely outcome of any combat sortie. Some of Germany's greatest aces fell during this period. Second Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down two Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighter, in October 1944. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied propeller aircraft, but even this technological marvel couldn't overcome the numerical and tactical superiority the Allies had achieved. The Luftwaffe tried desperate measures. They formed Sturmgruppen, heavily armored FW-190s designed to ram through bomber formations regardless of the cost. They developed the Me-163 Comet rocket interceptor, which could climb to bomber altitude in under 3 minutes but had only minutes of fuel. They even created units like Sonderkommando Elbe, where pilots were expected to ram Allied bombers in a final suicidal gesture. None of it mattered. The fundamental strategic equation had changed on March 4, 1944, and there was no going back. The impact of the Mustang over Berlin extended far beyond air combat statistics. The Allied bombing campaign, now protected by long-range escorts, began to systematically dismantle German war production. Oil refineries, transportation networks, and industrial centers were hit repeatedly. The German economy, which had weathered earlier bombing with remarkable resilience, began to crack under the sustained pressure. Oil production dropped catastrophically, from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to just 107,000 tons by September. Without fuel, Germany's tanks, trucks, and aircraft were reduced to static targets. The psychological impact on German civilians was equally significant. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that the Luftwaffe would protect the Reich. Now, day after day, American bombers appeared over German cities in broad daylight, while silver Mustangs circled overhead as if daring the Luftwaffe to respond. For the Allied bomber crews, the P-51 meant the difference between survival and death. Before the Mustang, bomber losses were so high that the statistical probability of surviving a 25-mission tour was roughly 25%. With Mustang escort, those odds improved dramatically. Men who had accepted they were likely to die now had a fighting chance of going home. The bonds between bomber crews and fighter pilots became legendary. Bomber crews would search the sky desperately for the distinctive silhouette of the Mustang. The P-51's appearance meant they weren't alone, that someone was looking out for them. Fighter pilots, in turn, developed fierce protective instincts toward their bombers. Captain John Godfrey, Don Gentile's wingman, described it simply: "We knew those boys in the bombers were counting on us. Every bomber we brought home safe was a victory, regardless of how many enemy fighters we shot down." By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The D-Day invasion on June 6 faced minimal air opposition, a stark contrast to what would have happened even a year earlier. The Allies achieved near-total air supremacy over the invasion beaches, allowing the ground forces to establish their foothold in France. The Luftwaffe's best pilots were still formidable. Men like Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace of all time with 352 victories, continued to exact a heavy toll on Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front, but Individual excellence couldn't overcome systematic collapse. German jet aircraft like the Me-262 showed what might have been possible if they'd been developed earlier and in greater numbers. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter, but it arrived too late and in too small numbers to make a difference. Allied fighters learned to attack the jets during takeoff and landing when they were vulnerable, and the chronic fuel shortages meant many jets sat unused on the ground. The Mustang's dominance was so complete that by late 1944, German fighters often refused to engage when they encountered P-51s, instead trying to slip past them to attack the bombers. This cat-and-mouse game rarely ended well for the Germans. The Mustang's speed advantage meant it could usually run down any German fighter trying to avoid combat. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, summarized the situation in his post-war memoir. The P-51 Mustang was the most significant tactical development of the war in Europe. It didn't just escort bombers, it hunted us. It was faster, could fly farther, and was available in numbers we couldn't match. After March 1944, we were fighting a defensive war we couldn't win. The human cost of the air war was staggering on both sides. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 300,000 men killed during World War II, a higher percentage casualty rate than any other German service. The average life expectancy of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot by 1944 was measured in weeks, not months. American losses were equally sobering. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties, with more than 26,000 killed. Every bomber that went down took 10 trained men with it: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, gunners. These weren't just statistics. They were sons, brothers, fathers, each one representing a personal tragedy multiplied across their communities back home. But the Mustang had tilted the balance. Loss rates, while still terrible, were manageable. The bombing campaign could continue, and as it continued, it ground down German war production, oil supplies, and transportation networks to the breaking point. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Fuel was so scarce that new pilots received minimal flight training. Many had less than 20 hours in their aircraft before being sent into combat, a death sentence against Allied pilots with hundreds of hours of experience flying superior aircraft. The final irony was that Germany was still producing fighters in significant numbers right up to the end of the war. Thousands of aircraft sat on airfields with no fuel to fly them, and no pilots trained to operate them. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not by a lack of aircraft, but by a lack of everything else needed to sustain an air force: fuel, pilots, spare parts, and most critically, control of the air. March 4, 1944 deserves to be remembered as one of the truly decisive moments of World War II. It wasn't a single climactic battle like Midway or Stalingrad. There was no dramatic surrender or breakthrough, but in its own way, it was just as significant. The appearance of American long-range fighters over Berlin fundamentally changed the strategic balance in Europe. It meant that Germany could no longer protect its industrial base, could no longer husband its forces for a decisive battle, could no longer rely on geography and distance to shield its heartland from attack. For the German military and political leadership, it meant the game was up. Rational officers understood that the war was lost. Even Hitler, despite his public bravado, began preparing his Nero decree, orders to destroy all German infrastructure rather than let it fall into Allied hands, suggesting he knew the end was coming. For the Allied forces, it meant the path to victory was clear. The combined bomber offensive could proceed as planned. The invasion of France could go forward with air superiority assured. The war would still cost hundreds of thousands more lives and drag on for another brutal year. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. And for the men who flew the P-51 Mustang, it meant they had earned their place in history. They had turned the tide of the air war. They had protected thousands of their fellow airmen. They had shown that American industry, innovation, and courage could overcome even the most formidable enemy. The legacy of that March day in 1944 extends far beyond World War II. The P-51 Mustang became the symbol of American air power: sleek, fast, powerful, and victorious. It served in the Korean War and with air forces around the world for decades after. Even today, restored Mustangs at air shows draw crowds who want to see and hear the aircraft that changed the course of history. The strategic lessons were equally enduring. The importance of long-range escort fighters, the value of air supremacy, the vulnerability of even the most powerful nation if it cannot protect its airspace. These became fundamental principles of modern warfare. But perhaps most importantly, March 4, 1944 represents a very human story of courage and sacrifice. The bomber crews who faced death on every mission, the fighter pilots who protected them against impossible odds, the German pilots fighting for a lost cause with desperate bravery, the civilians on both sides who suffered and died in a conflict they didn't start and couldn't control. When Luftwaffe pilots looked up on that March day and saw Mustangs circling over Berlin, they saw the future. They saw that the age of German air dominance was over. They saw that their cities would burn, their factories would be destroyed, and their nation would be defeated. But they also saw something else, the terrible cost of the war their leaders had started. The bombers overhead represented not just military power, but the accumulated wrath of nations pushed to total war. The Mustangs weren't just fighters. They were the instrument of strategic victory, the tool that would allow the Allies to bring the war home to Germany itself. Hermann Göring's quote, whether he said it exactly that way or not, captures the essential truth. When American fighters appeared over Berlin, the war was indeed lost for Germany. Everything that followed, the continued fighting, the Battle of the Bulge, the final collapse was epilogue to the decision made in the skies over Berlin on March 4, 1944. The exact moment Luftwaffe pilots saw P-51s over Berlin wasn't just another day in the air war. It was the moment when the tide became irreversible, when hope turned to despair, when victory became inevitable. It was the moment that changed everything. And on a cold March afternoon, 20,000 feet above the German capital, the men who made that moment happen, American pilots in sleek silver fighters, earned their place in history. They didn't just win a battle. They changed the course of the war and helped save the world from tyranny. That's why March 4, 1944 matters. That's why we remember. And that's why the story of the P-51 Mustang over Berlin will be told as long as people care about courage, sacrifice, and the fight for freedom.